Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the American Bell Society's annual colloquy and its inaugural lecture, which will be delivered by Elaine Scarry, Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and the General Theory of Value at Harvard University, who in a moment will be properly introduced by my colleague, co-organizer of this colloquy and friend, Professor Brinton Lykes from the Lynch School of Education and Human Development, and co-director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice here at Boston College. My name is Tomeo Stelrich. I am the former president of the American Bell Society and the director of the Center for Ignition Spirituality here at Boston College. It is a privilege and an honor to welcome all of you this afternoon, especially the members of the American Bell Society. Just a year ago, we were supposed to celebrate this colloquy here on the grounds of Boston College in an in-person format, but for reasons that we know all too well, we had to postpone it till tonight in this telematic format. Starting tomorrow till Saturday, the participants of the colloquy will meet daily from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. approximately to learn about Simone Weil's understanding of spirituality, beauty, and justice. And we will learn that from 22 presenters speaking from different parts of the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Norway, Japan, and Belgium. Participants in the colloquy are literally from all over the world. If you are interested in attending, but you have not registered yet, you will find the link to the colloquy momentarily on your chat. I would like you to end these welcoming remarks by extending my gratitude to Sophie Bourgeau and Scott Ridner, President and Vice President of the American Bell Society, for their help and support. The presenters and panel moderators for their generous and gracious participation. To Brinton Lykes and Tim Karch for their hard work preparing this event, and to the sponsors that have made possible this colloquy possible. The Boston College Center for Human Rights and International Justice, the Boston College Institute for the Liberal Arts, and the American Bell Society. Brinton?
Thank you, Tomeo. As you just heard from my colleague, Tomeo, Professor Scarry teaches at Harvard University, where she is the Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and the General Theory of Value. She also lectures nationally and internationally on nuclear war, law, literature, and medicine. Her work has two central subjects, the nature of physical injury and the nature of human creation. One of her earlier works, The Body in Pain, brings the subjects of injuring and creating together. It argues that the willful infliction of pain and injury is the opposite of creation, since it apes and inverts the ordinary work of the imagination. She lectured here at Boston College about this work nearly 3 decades ago, when I was a visiting scholar at the Jesuit Institute and had the distinct pleasure of having her speak about this work as I was in my early years of what was to become 3 years of accompanying Maya women and children who have persisted in creative and embodied praxis in search of justice in the wake of horrific inflictions of pain and injury at the hands of repressive military forces trained and funded in the United States. It is therefore my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Scarry back to Boston College and to hear about her work since then. Her book On Beauty and Being Just brings the two together, arguing that beauty and justice are alike in having injury or injustice as the thing that is their opposite, and that they together work to diminish. Her other writings, rather than bringing the two subjects together, emphasize either injuring or instead creating. Her recent book, Thermonuclear Monarchy, Choosing Between Democracy and Doom, shows that nuclear weapons and governance, particularly democratic governance, are mutually exclusive. It specifies the constitutional tools available for dismantling the country's nuclear architecture. Her writings on the process of poetic creation include Dreaming by the Book, Naming Thy Name, Crosstalk in Shakespeare's Sonnets, as well as multiple essays on Proust, Rilke, Emily Bronte, and John Donne. It is a distinct pleasure to listen to her this evening as she presents her talk entitled Beauty and the Pact of Aliveness. Welcome, Professor Scarry.
Thank you, Britton, and thank you for introducing me. I'm very grateful to Britton and Tim and Tomeo for having me here, and to all of you for being here and coming to this lecture. Aristotle says in both books 2 and book 5 of Nicomachean Ethics that a just society is one that will make its population care to be just. Commentators sometimes describe this as a casual point on the way to his more important points. But I want to stay with that point for a moment because I think it's absolutely crucial. It means that a just society and just relations are likely to be self-sustaining. Both the state and the citizenry enjoy the benefits of circularity. A just society will instigate in us the desire to be just, and we will therefore in turn keep our society in place. That is, we will notice if there begin to be tears in the fabric of justice, precisely because we care to be just. But we should also notice that there's a terrible corollary to Aristotle's statement, and that is that an unjust society will not instill in its citizens the desire to be just. We might even say an unjust society will be one that leaves its citizenry indifferent to injustice. In that case, we will ignore it, or in the worst case, possibly even promote it. There's a second corollary. Aristotle's simple formulation helps us to understand the baffling phenomenon of looking at past wrongs and, as we often do, finding it incomprehensible that a given citizenry could have permitted so obvious an injustice as slavery in 19th century America, or as mass killings in 20th century Germany. But the citizens of those countries were living in countries that, by the very act of instituting those practices, eventually instilled in their citizenry an indifference, an inability to recognize injustice. Though we tell ourselves that had we been living there, we would have rebelled, in fact, it may be only because we're not now in the midst of those practices that we can so easily recognize them as intolerable. It also means that it's possible that we are at this very moment living in the midst of an injustice, possibly even an injustice as great as those I've mentioned, which we are willing to shrug off. What is there that can press us toward justice in a situation where we do not have the just arrangements to instigate in us the care to be just, the desire to be just? Under ordinary conditions, beauty presses us in the direction of justice and even provides a lifeline when we are in non-ordinary conditions. I'll try to support these claims in this lecture. Both beauty and justice, as Britton mentioned a moment ago, have injury as their opposite. The word injustice comes from the root word injury. I strongly believe that the word injury is also the most accurate word for the state that is opposite to beauty. The opposition between beauty and injury is discernible in everyday practice, whether we are contemplating a river or a person or a math theorem or a painting. It can seem harsh to conclude that any one of these locations is, if badly injured, somehow outside the realm of beauty, as in the case of a polluted river or a soldier whose face has been terribly defaced by an explosion, or a painting that is torn. Along the way, the opposition often confronts us with painful consequences that we have to wrestle with, and in any given instance may have to overcome. But overall, it is not too much to say that the opposition between beauty and injury is life-saving. Part of the work of beauty is to make us unequivocally opposed to injury, to make us not just rationally, but irrationally and intuitively opposed. If that were not the case, if we started to persuade ourselves that an injured person or a poisoned beech tree or a shattered stained glass window or an error-ridden mathematical proof were as beautiful as a non-injured person, tree, window proof, what would stop us from inflicting injuries on people, windows, trees, and lying about the solution to a math problem? You might say community rules would stop us, but how did we arrive at these? Before we had those community rules, beauty helped bring them about. And what if those rules disappear? Our first visceral instinct when we see someone being injured is to stop it. Our first visceral instinct, if we see an injury, is to repair it. If a friend ceases to be able to walk, our first obligation is to see if his legs can be repaired, not to persuade him and oneself that his condition is acceptable and lovely. If repair to his body is not possible, then we will repair the city by introducing ramps and lifts so that not being able to walk ceases to be an injury. But our first act is to recognize an injury as something aversive and that we want to eliminate if it's within human possibility to do so. Beauty, in other words, is not some ornamental or optional habit of mind. It keeps intact our deep aversion to injury, an aversion to inflicting it, a sense that where it exists, it must be eliminated. So in arguing that beauty is a life pact, my first realm of evidence is this profound visceral aversion to injury, the prohibition each of us feels on inflicting it, and the desire each of us feels to repair it. But we have assistance in recognizing this from other quarters. So the second realm of evidence is the many centuries of poets, philosophers, theologians, and scientists who equate beauty with heightened aliveness and its opposite with diminished aliveness or injury or even death. Poets, philosophers, and art theorists have over millennia seen beauty as a life pact. In the book that Brinton mentioned on beauty and being just, I look at the sixth book of the Odyssey. Homer describes the moment when Odysseus is saved from what is described as the man-killing ocean. He sees the child Nausicaa and sees in her newbornness, new life. So too Augustine and De Musica describe beauty as a life-saving plank in the midst of the ocean. The face of Beatrice inspired Dante to write the Divine Comedy, but before he wrote the Divine Comedy, he wrote a book called The New Life, La Vita Nuova. Rilke, in the archaic torso of Apollo, says beauty confronts us with the imperative, you must change your life. Kant, in the third critique of judgment, repeatedly asks us to recognize the bond between beauty and aliveness, as the philosopher Rudolf Macreal alerts us. This is an observation that is often ignored in looking at the third critique. And there are countless other examples. For example, one anthropologist, Francesco Polizzi, asked a group of Native American, one particular group of Native American people, what the word was in their language for beauty, and the answer came back, aliveness. So is this association of beauty and aliveness wishful thinking? Is it figurative? Is it literal? I think that it's literal. The formulation may seem melodramatic in speaking of man-killing oceans and planks in the midst of the ocean, but I think there are two very literal claims embedded in the association. First, beauty repairs the ground and restores trust. It puts ground under our feet. Second, beauty demands a higher level of perceptual acuity, a vivacity of perception. It raises the bar for what counts as seeing. I've sometimes had students worry that beautiful persons and things will steal attention away from the rest of the world, away from the rest of us. So I asked them to conduct the following experiment. The next time you are walking down the street and suddenly find yourself stopped in your tracks by a beautiful face or a beautiful bird or by the sunrise, ask yourself, were you walking along generously contemplating the rest of the world and its problems, or were you in a daze until the face or the bird or the sunrise suddenly woke you up and brought about a much higher level of attention, which you can then give to the rest of the world, to the rest of us? That is, again, it sets the bar higher for what is going to count as attention. So far, this sounds like beauty is one directional, that beautiful things, whether poems or paintings or music or math equations, heighten our own aliveness. But in what sense is this reciprocal? That is, how do they become the beneficiaries? If it's a pact, they should receive some of the benefits. If the object of beauty is something already alive, like a brook or a person or a forest or a bird, it gets us to care for it and insofar as we can to protect it. If it is not alive, if it is an artifact, it prompts us to confer the privileges of life-likeness on that artifact. If a painting is stolen from the Gardner Museum, as one Vermeer painting was, or if a painting is stolen from the National Gallery in Berlin, as in fact Lucian Freud's painting of Francis Bacon was painted, and by coincidence I happened to be in the museum when that occurred. When that happens, people across the whole earth have a concern for the surface of the painting, for its well-being, as though it were alive. To become the steward or guardian of or protector is the work carried out by museum curators, librarians, and teachers. But this act of stewardship is also something carried out by the public at large. The work of beauty to diminish injury, to diminish the near synonym injustice, is a cause-effect dyad that drifts across populations and centuries, rather than something like a light switch that happens in any one person, now on, now off, and can, without fail, be predicted to occur. At the same time, there are countless moments when the straightforward light switch is apprehensible, as one can feel on one's own pulses, when one feels oneself recoiling from the spectacle of inflicted injury. An experiment in Sweden in 1984 and published in Science, the journal Science, showed that hospital patients whose rooms faced into a grove of trees recovered much more quickly from their operations and required much less pain medication than patients whose rooms faced onto a brick wall. Since that time, 1984, almost 2,000 follow-up medical studies have been done, all of which confirm the same outcome, according to the Canadian Medical Association Journal. This consequence, in turn, has had another major consequence, namely that there's been a much greater emphasis on designing beautiful hospitals. In fact, if you look at medical magazines and architectural magazines, you'll see that they often have articles about the 25 most beautiful hospitals in North America, or the 10 most beautiful hospitals in the world. Though all of these studies and outcomes are addressing the problem of physical injury and our attempts to heal it, it may be that beauty also works to heal psychic pain. So some European countries are beginning to design prisons that emphasize gardens and window light. You may also have heard of a recent experiment done at Berkeley in which the experimenter asked one group of students to look up into a very high grove, the canopy of a high grove of eucalyptus trees, and asked another group of students to stare at a blank wall. He then pretended to accidentally drop a box of pens, and it turned out that the students in the first group much more often sprang to his assistance in collecting the spilled pens. So this reciprocal conferring of aliveness is then a kind of life pact. It's no accident that those who have worked tirelessly on behalf of the earth and all its species, like the environmentalist Rachel Carson and also John Muir, or that those who fiercely oppose nuclear weapons, like Jonathan Schell or the philosopher Bertrand Russell, have often attributed their work to the beauty of earth. Rachel Carson, for example, quotes the British naturalist Richard Jefferies, quote, "The hours when the mind is absorbed by beauty are the only hours when we truly live." Major journals today invoke the beauty of earth as an argument for why we should all be working to stop climate change. The National Geographic, for example, has one article with the title, "The Formidable, Fragile Beauty of Warming Landscapes." Scientific American, another journal, has an article entitled, "Arctic Beauty in Black and White, Alaska Before the Effects of Global Warming." Wired magazine, a very different magazine, has an article, quote, "Beautiful polar photos tell a haunting story about climate change." And finally, NASA, the National Aeronautic Space Agency, has an article titled "Climate Change, Vital Signs of the Planet, Beautiful Earth." So to recapitulate so far, the opposition between beauty and injury is, first of all, certified on our own pulses in the way we long to stay in the midst of beauty and perceive injury as aversive. Second, it's audible in the long sequence of poets and philosophers who associate beauty with heightened aliveness. Third, it's observable in the literal realization of those claims in our own intensified acuity in the presence of beauty and our heightened desire to protect the beautiful. And four, observable in the literal speed of physical healing in hospitals and psychic healing in prisons. Remember too, that injury is not only the opposite of beauty, but the opposite of justice. It's the root word. Injury is the root word in the word injustice. The opposition between beauty and injury means that when justice is on the wane, that is, that when we don't have a framework in mind to make us care to be just, we have beauty still intact and in place to take over that work. In other words, if both beauty and justice have injury as their opposite, even when we have a healthy framework of justice, beauty is there silently. We don't notice that it's doing this, helping to press us toward justice. But when justice disappears, and it's often made to disappear, beauty is still there, alerting us to, pressing us to care about justice. I want to go on now and try and articulate something of exactly how this happens. And in doing so, it's helpful to remember that when we speak about beauty or the beautiful, we're often talking about three different sites of beauty. It may be that we're talking about the beautiful thing itself. We might be talking about the beautiful face of a friend, or we might be talking about a Greek vase, or we might be talking about the dawn. And when we do so, we usually identify certain formal features such as symmetry, clarity, color, vivacity, and unity that are entailed in the beauty of the thing. In the second site of beauty, we're speaking not about the object, but about the perceptual event. And we have really scores of descriptions like this over time, the most famous of which is Plato's account in the Phaedrus of what happens when Socrates sees a beautiful boy. His knees buckle, he begins to feel his shoulder blades prickling because he's beginning to grow wings and remember immortality. The third site is again in the perceiver, but this time it is not what happens to the perceiver in the first split second of coming upon beauty, but in the minutes or hours or even days afterward. And what happens then in that aftermath is an act of creation. So let me go back to the three sites and try to specify or make audible or begin to make audible the way in which this works. Remember, the first site is the beautiful object itself, let's say a Greek vase, or a flower blossom, or a lover's face, or a painting, or a poem, or a mathematical equation. Formal attributes such as symmetry or vivacity anticipate parallel, but much more difficult to attain attributes in the realm of justice. The symmetry of beautiful faces and beautiful equations, or the beautiful rays of the setting sun, anticipate by many, many centuries, since they've, in many of those cases, been present since the beginning of the world, anticipate by many centuries John Rawls' definition of justice as fairness, in which fairness requires a symmetry in all our relations with one another. Today, Rawls' theory of justice is one of the most widely known accounts of justice, but it's difficult to find any account of justice that does not emphasize symmetry. So, for example, Plato talks about the need for symmetry between crimes and punishments. We have Marx, who told us about the need for symmetry between work and compensation for work. Or we talked today about the need to have a symmetry between the amount of compensation male workers and female workers get, or workers of different races get. And there are other examples. For example, Hume talks about the symmetry between expectations and fulfillment, and so on. Now, I'm going to speak for a moment more about symmetry, because I think it's so important, and because it's one that people often question me about. They're more ready to accept the second and third sight. In the book on Beauty and Being Just, I cite the fact that political philosopher Amartya Sen, when I asked him if he thought the beauty of symmetry was in justice, said yes, he could remember as a child hearing Aristotle's description of justice as a perfect cube. But other philosophers, whom I greatly respect, have sometimes challenged me, saying, well, it's an analogy, or even it's a pun, or they will say, we believe you, we agree, may even agree with you that beauty presses us to justice, but you don't need symmetry. And personally, I believe that one of the reasons we resist symmetry in both aesthetics and elsewhere is because our country is so steeped in asymmetry. Just to take one example, we talk all the time about US-China relations. The United States has over 800 foreign bases. China, depending on how you count, has between 0 and I think 2. So let me say a bit more about symmetry. First of all, the pressure towards the aesthetic category of symmetry, towards justice, is often described by poets. Many of you know the poem by Wordsworth, Tintern Abbey, where he looks at the beautiful symmetrical forms in the remains of Tintern Abbey and says, I've looked at these not as a blind man. He says, these beauteous forms have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eyes. And then he goes on to say how one looks on it, what the effect of these forms are. And he says that they are responsible for, and here's the quote, his little unremembered acts of kindness and of love. So too, that's at the beginning of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, Thomas Hardy says something very similar in a poem called The Lunar Eclipse. He watches the eclipse and sees the shadow, the beautiful round shadow of Earth passing over the moon. And he is stunned by the discrepancy between the symmetry of that shadow and the asymmetry of what occurs on Earth, the cruelty on Earth. He says, how shall I link such sun-cast symmetry with the toil troubled form I know as thine? It produces heartache at seeing that the world doesn't live up to its own shadow. And we see these discrepancies all the time. For example, between Eric Garner, killed for selling a cigarette, to George Floyd for killing for possibly using a counterfeit $20 bill, to Breonna Taylor for being killed for being in bed beside her boyfriend, who was not himself selling drugs, but may have, the police believed, been the recipient of mailed drugs. And as you know from Britain, having said that I've done a book on thermonuclear monarchy, the asymmetry between our own gigantic arsenal and our complaints about Iran, who has 0, our complaints about Iraq in the past, who has 0, our complaints about North Korea that has fewer than 30, when we have thousands and have them on alert. It's another example of colossal asymmetry. Simone Weil certainly cared a great deal about beauty in a letter, about symmetry. In a letter to her brother in 1940, she says that where Pythagoreans spoke of numbers, they weren't just speaking of integers. She writes, quite the contrary. When they said that justice, et cetera, are numbers, it seems to me they made it clear they were using the word to describe every kind of proportion. This is a very long letter, and by a page later, she comes back to it. Number for Greeks, she says, was a matter of religious preoccupation, and therefore, because they were Greeks, partly also of aesthetics. Again, she says, Plato placed over the door of the academy, none enters here unless he is a geometer. And he said, God is ever a geometer. Then one page later, she says, I think therefore that from a fairly remote antiquity, the idea of proportion had been the theme of meditation, which was one of the chief methods, and perhaps the chief method of purifying the soul. So symmetry, proportion, meditating on it is a way of purifying the soul. In a letter to the editor of a particular newspaper, she speaks of the great and beautiful project of multilateral negotiation in the spirit of justice to bring about the general pacification of Europe. Now, of course, in these letters in the same period, she calls attention to asymmetries and to scalding injustices. For example, in her 1939 or 40, the date is uncertain, letter to the French Minister of Propaganda, she talks about the scalding injustices of what France has done to Vietnam or Annam. Was it not, she says, a peaceful, united, organized country with a historic culture and enriched by Chinese, Hindu, and Buddhist influences? She talks about their belief in karma and nemesis as the automatic punishment for excess. We have killed their culture. We forbid their access to the manuscripts of their language. We have imposed upon a small section of them our own culture, which has no roots among them and can do them no good. Although there is a chronic famine in the north of their country, the plentiful rice of the south is exported abroad. There is the annual tax, which is the same for the poor as for the rich. That is, in each of those sentences, it's asymmetry, 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 asymmetry. And again, she writes of Arabs in Africa, quote, and how can it be said that we brought culture to the Arabs when it was they who preserved the traditions of Greece for us throughout the Middle Ages? So I'll return now to the second site of, remember that was all the first site, the fact that the object of beauty has certain features, and I took the example of symmetry, that press us to justice. Now I'll go to the second site of beauty, where it's not the object, but the cognitive event that happens when suddenly comes into the presence of the beautiful object. And of the hundreds of accounts that we have of this, to me, the two most striking are given by two women philosophers, Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil, who speak of the unselfing or radical decentering that comes about in the presence of beauty. Iris Murdoch gives the example of being in a state of self-preoccupation, worrying about her work, worrying about her status. She hasn't been fully enough appreciated, she feels, and then suddenly seeing a bird lift off in flight. At that moment, she says, all one's self-absorption falls away and one undergoes an unselfing. In Waiting for God, Simone Weil referred to this phenomenon as a radical decentering, because we're suddenly swept to the sidelines. And I often use the term for this, opiated adjacency, and I like this term because it reminds us that there are many events on earth that make us feel acute pleasure. So I use the term, they opiate us. And there are many events on earth that make us feel lateral or marginal or on the sidelines. But there's no event other than beauty that does those two simultaneously, that makes us feel marginal or lateral while making us feel acute pleasure in that state. None of us is the center of the world, but each of us can get into the mistake of believing that we are the center of our own world. Beauty relieves us of this. It not only puts us on the sideline, but makes us acutely happy to be on the sidelines. Becoming capable of experiencing bliss in one's own lateralness may not be itself a state of justice, but it certainly prepares us for doing such work in the world. Iris Murdoch arrived at her account of beauty by asking the question, What is it that makes us good? Not, she said, what makes us talk about being good or write about being good, what makes us actually good? And she said, of all things, the thing that does it most is beauty. Now I'll turn to the third site of beauty, where one, again, is speaking of the perceiver, the perceptual event that happens in the perceiver, but this time the perceiver in the enduring moments after coming into the presence of the beautiful, not in the first split second. Accounts over many centuries report the link between the exposure to the beautiful and the desire to create. Diotima in the Symposium tells Socrates, who tells Plato and the rest of us, that beauty in the face of the person you love can give rise to the desire to bring children into the world. But Diotima also says that beautiful persons and things not only prompt the creation of children, but the creation of poems, plays, legal treatises, and works of philosophy. 20th century philosophers agree with Diotima. What is it, Wittgenstein asks, that happens when we stand in the presence of a beautiful cathedral or boy or flower? He answers, when the eye sees something beautiful, the hand wants to draw it. Now, often in the book that I've written and elsewhere, instead of using the word creation, I use the word replication simply because I want to make it clear that this is descriptive not only of very great outcomes like a newborn child or a painting or a poem that goes on to be well known, but of simple everyday acts such as taking a photograph or telling a friend about something you saw, or simply making sure that you sustain the time of looking at the beautiful thing for 20 seconds longer than you originally intended. These everyday outcomes are also acts of creation. They are counterfactual. They bring into existence something that wasn't the case before. Now, how exactly do such acts of creation relate to justice? Well, first, they do so for this reason. Beauty can either be naturally occurring or artificially occurring. Beauty can occur in a field of wildflowers, but it can also occur in Monet's painting of wildflowers, his painting that's for example, in the Boston Museum of poppies in a field. But justice is always artifactual. So beauty can be natural or artifactual. Justice is always artifactual. Justice always requires acts of human intervention and creation. Anything, therefore, which puts us in touch with our own powers of creation is itself a contribution to the ongoing aspiration for justice. The philosopher David Hume is among those who have emphasized this point. He said that natural virtues need to have some benign outcome in order to be considered good, to be considered virtues, whereas artificial or artifactual virtues need have no immediate visible outcome, since the mere exercise of our capacity for creation, for the artifactual, is a good outcome, something we need. The second way in which beauty, by at once awakening us to our capacity for the artifactual, contributes to justice is simply that it is tied to the desire to bring more things in the world so that there will eventually be enough. In the past, there were names for that desire to have enough, such as infinity or caritas, where you distributed your love out to everyone and not just one person. But it can also today be understood in terms of the language of distribution. So this third site is important both because it incites us to the exercise of the artifactual, greatly needed in the realm of justice, and second, because it is bound up with the pressure towards distribution and with the awakening of our capacity to create, our capacity to work. If you saw the news conference following George Floyd's verdict yesterday, you heard the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, praise the work of the young bystanders, Danielle Frazier, her 9-year-old cousin, and Genevieve Hansen and others, whom he referred to as a bouquet of humanity, who, on behalf of someone they didn't know, came forward and helped. And he ends his address by saying to us, all of us must stand forward and do whatever small thing we can. And he ended with the words, let's get the work done. Beauty puts us in touch with our ability to act, to get the work done. So beauty assists us in the work of justice, even when a just framework is securely in place. And it does much more work if justice is not in place. And I've suggested before, but I should repeat it, that beauty comes into the world long before justice. For example, I mentioned earlier that Plato talks about the need for symmetry between crimes and punishment. By the 19th century, at one point, Parliament did a study of how many crimes were punishable by death, and there were 200 crimes punishable and punished by death. And certainly today, we don't feel we've figured this out, that we understand the relationship between crime and punishment, as witness the fact that people are getting murdered for tiny acts, whereas other people, white people, for example, can carry out huge theft, stealing pension plans of people and so forth, and there's no reprisal. Yet, even though this isn't worked out in the realm of justice, perfect examples of beauty in the faces of flowers, or in mathematical proofs, or in sunlight, or in spheres, which Parmenides called the most perfect of shapes, exist all around us. The second thing is, not only does beauty come into the world much earlier than justice, but it stays longer. It's harder to destroy. Even in places where justice was wholly wiped out, there were fragments of beauty, as we hear from prisoners in concentration camp who tell us that they held on to certain musical phrases and played them in their minds. One prisoner in Guantanamo was asked by a Red Cross worker if there was anything she could bring him, and he said, a photograph of a flower. A scholar told me that when she interviewed Romanian women who were in a Romanian prison, they described to her the fact that they would take strands from their undergarments and weave little 1-inch by 1-inch squares and give them to each other as a way of dealing with the injustice they were suffering. Finally, even in a world that has a great deal of justice, beauty is much more bountiful. For the next couple of minutes, I want to stress the plenitude, the astonishing plenitude of beauty, the ever increasing plenitude across an individual lifetime. And those of you who are very young must, for the moment, take my word for it, that the number increases with every day and year that one lives. And in this way, I think it's analogous to color vision. John Dewey, the philosopher John Dewey, accurately says that it takes a child several years of actively dealing with the world to be able reliably to discern such gross color discriminations as black, white, red, and green. And if you have little children around you, you might notice that counting is a breeze for them often, whereas getting these colors can be very, very tough. Yet current neuroscientists tell us that the average adult can distinguish 26,000 colors and millions of colors if gray tones are included. Over a long lifetime, assuming one is not in pain or surrounded by a damaged environment or living in the midst of grave injustice, more and more moments of the day are interrupted by small explosions of the beautiful. Like color, beauty is something we learn to see. Perhaps in childhood, it takes work to recognize the first 7 instances, but after many years, the number may be closer to 26,000. And just as in the realm of color, a painter by endless practice may go well beyond the ordinary to become a virtuoso colorist, so those whose everyday practice requires their attention to beauty, say a gardener or a cloud watcher or those who draw, they may acquire a virtuoso ability. It's not the numbers that are important. You might wish to add or subtract zeros from the number I gave of 26,000. But the fact is that the number is very large, and that far from demanding that we continually whittle down candidates until we finally get to just 1 or 2, Instead, beauty hones our minds to enable us to see more and more instances. If beautiful things are like lighthouse beacons, steering us away from injury and pressing us towards justice, these lighthouses are usually steadily in our midst. The fact that many beautiful things are universally, or at least widely shared, misleads us into thinking that universality, whether in fact or theory, is a necessary feature. The realm of beautiful objects includes not only those that are widely and enduringly shared across centuries and geographies, such as the sky, but things that are specific to small groups of people and to single observers. This plurality or variability in the objects of beauty is another of its benign features. It would be very unfortunate if every one of us chose the same mate. It would even be unfortunate if every one of us chose to live in exactly the same house. Beauty plays a part in deciding the partner with whom and the room in which one lives. Both shared and unshared objects of beauty, both those that endure across millennia and those that are short-lived, like the position of a fallen leaf on the sidewalk, work together to affirm the life pact and to push us in the direction of greater regard for just relations. They together carry out the foundational work of beauty. Plenitude is something that Simone Weil very much credited in the realm of beauty. Her letters, which I'm going to speak about for a minute or two, are, like all her writings, ones that show her to be a powerful thinker. For example, reading one of them, I was struck by the strategic rigor she was using, and I read it aloud to my life partner, and he, though he's very familiar with her writings, he scratched his head and said, it sounds like Henry Kissinger. Another letter I read, she really sounds like Joan of Arc because of the sheer magnitude of her arrogance, and I mean that in the best sense of the word. She will be talking to her brother about the way in which Pythagoras solved a certain mathematical problem and said, I think I've discovered an alternative way to prove that. Or she will say that Plato and Pythagoras both got their ideas from some third source, and then she acknowledges, no, she doesn't acknowledge that there's no evidence. She boasts that there's no evidence for this, but all the more reason why that makes it a good insight on her part. And she, at one point, talks about how she despises Nietzsche, and then notes that she's able to maintain this feeling of despising Nietzsche, even when he's announcing a belief that she shares. But in the midst of this rigorous letters and this kind of crosstalk between Henry Kissinger and Joan of Arc, there is a kind of tremendous crediting of the realm of the plurality of beauty, the plenitude of beauty. And these are all letters from the decade of the 1930s, letters written to her mother, to her brother, to her friend Jean Pasternak and others that literally surge with the beauty of the world, whether nature, when she's talking about the olive trees of Italy, or math when she's speaking with her brother, or painting when she's describing the Last Supper, or physics when she's describing Planck's, and now I'm quoting, sensational discovery about the stable state of electrons, or architecture like the Medici Chapel or the Benedictine Monastery or St. Peter's, or music such as an opera she hears under moonlight or a Platonic dialogue. The sentences in her letters are punctuated with aesthetic adjectives, and often adjectives accompanied by intensifiers. And I notice this because in the humanities, there is sometimes, I think, a practice of abstaining from using the word beautiful. Not so with Simone Weil. She uses intensifiers. She doesn't say beautiful, now I'm quoting a letter to her mother, but most beautiful. She doesn't say original, she says extraordinarily original. Of a Benedictine monastery, she tells her mother, not that it's a jewel, but that it's a pure jewel. Of Rome, she says that not that it has grandeur, but that it has overwhelming grandeur. So too, in her letters to Jean Pasternak, we move across a handbridge of aesthetic phrases. Two, moving, really beautiful, delicious piazzas, delightful music, beautiful spring, and always the intensifiers. San Miniato, she says, is not beautiful at sunset, but very beautiful at sunset. Certain lines from the Odyssey are not true, but miraculously true. Nor does she refrain from a series. Here's a cluster of sentences. At Bologna, I fell to the temptation of trains labeled for Ferrara and Ravenna, two really beautiful towns. Do you remember the Diamante Palace? At Ravenna, it was market day. Humanity was beautiful too, especially the young peasants. When Providence places beautiful people among beautiful things, it is a superabundance of grace. So she's just used the word beautiful 4 times in that tiny passage. Superabundance is, we learn from these letters, the appropriate response to beauty. She even at one point calls it the proper response. She enacts superabundance by doing what we all do. She seeks to prolong her contact with the beautiful thing, either by prolonging it backward in time or forward in time. So both antecedent and subsequent to the actual moment. For example, she tells Jean Pasternak in that same second letter of spring 1837, she tells him that as for Florence, it is my own city. Surely I must have lived a previous life among its olives. As soon as I saw the lovely bridges across the Arno, I wondered how I had stayed away so long, and Florence wondered too, no doubt, because towns love to be loved. I have no heart left for loving Venice because Florence has taken it. So you can hear in that she invents for herself a previous lifetime when she resided in Florence. And she enacts the idea of a reciprocal life pact. She loves Florence, but Florence loves her back and was very glad for her love because towns like to be loved. She also extends the timeline on the other end. At Milan, after an hour or two of contemplation, she says, I perceived the composition, the secret of the composition of the Last Supper. Again, this is our magnificently self-believing Simone Weil. Quote, at the time, there seemed to me to be no valid reason for not spending one's whole life in the convent refectory. In a third letter to Jean Pasternak, she says, at Assisi, I forgot all about Milan, Florence, Rome, and the rest. I was so overcome by such graceful landscapes, so miraculously evangelical and Franciscan. She goes on, touching, blissful, noble. I had never dreamed of such a marvelous country, a little marvel of architecture. I might almost have spent the rest of my life there. There could be no serener, more paradisial view than Umbria seen from up there. St. Francis knew how to choose the most delicious places in which to live in poverty. He was not at all ascetic. I was just afraid I was being notified of my time being short, but I think I'm okay, aren't I? A few minutes left? Okay, good. St. Francis knew how to choose, and we'll hear her giving prescriptions to us on how to react. One must have intense feelings and make them visible, at least in the letters. This is so. This is a third letter to Jean Pasternak about a piece of music. It happens to be an opera by Monteverdi that was played in an amphitheater by moonlight. Listen to what she says. It was a marvel to be remembered one's whole life. The public was cool, those brutes. Luckily, however, my enjoyment was enough to fill the whole amphitheater. So the public was cool, those brutes. How could they have been cool? She twice tells Jean Pasternak that what one should feel in reading Plato's Phaedrus is exodus. Here is the first letter. Her letter ends, I hope Plato has arrived and that you are reading the Phaedrus between 2 hearings of the 4th Brandenburg on Dante and that you are plunged in ecstasy. In her third letter to him, she writes, I was glad to see that you are reading Plato in the proper state of mind, that is to say, in ecstasy. We can see then throughout the letters the principle of aesthetic superabundance. Even after complaining of St. Peter's, she says, but even as it is, I loved it beyond measure. Finally, she signs many of her letters with the Greek word for goodbye, which she tells the recipient means be joyful. Again, it is an instruction, be joyful. Simone Weil's salutation is no doubt the best place to end, but I want to provide one last reflection. I've emphasized the plurality of beautiful things, their plenitude, to say that even when a framework of justice is intact and can work to instill in us the wish to be just, even then the sheer plenitude of beauty makes it of great assistance. How often do we stop each day and say, oh, there's a pocket of just relations, or, oh, look, here is human rights perfectly at work, or here crime and punishment seem just in the right ratio, even in a basically just society, justice is almost always imperfect. In contrast, how many times a day, especially for those of us who have been on earth for a while, do we find ourselves face to face with beauty? I've said, in citing the Guantanamo prisoner and the Romanian prisoner and the concentration camp survivor, that while it's possible to at least temporarily eliminate justice altogether, beauty survives and seems almost impossible to eliminate from the world. It's always possible that a bird will fly through that prison. But now in closing, I have to ask, is it in fact the case that beauty cannot be eliminated? The scale of the two great perils we face now, global warming and nuclear conflict, may well have the ability to destroy the beauty of Earth. Earlier, I cited the journals that point to the beauty of Earth as a way of galvanizing us to work to diminish the peril of global warming. But perhaps they cite it because they think that precisely this beauty of Earth is what threatens to disappear. Of all objects on Earth, over many millennia, the most widely and enduringly beloved is no doubt the sun, what Pseudo-Dionysius calls the manifest image of divine goodness, our great, completely radiant, and always lit sun. Surely he is thinking of all plant and animal life and not just human life when he 3 times repeats the sentence, all sensible, that is, beings that have sensation, all sensible beings desire it, for they desire to be visible, moved, illuminated, heated, and in general, to be brought to the light. But if everywhere on earth soon begins to burn, will we cease to regard the sun as beautiful? The fact that we may not, the fact that we may lose our most widely shared object of beauty summarizes the scale of the global warming tragedy. And what of the oceans? Will they still be beautiful once they have rolled over Miami and Manhattan and Atlantic City and Saigon and Bangkok and Alexandria, and tens of millions of desk chairs and computers and building windows and Venetian blinds and asphalt and street lights harm all the ocean's beautiful creatures in a way that the scrim of plastic now hurting them hardly touches? Shouldn't we be moving these buildings inland so that the beauty of the seas and its inhabitants can survive? While I'm uncertain of the harm to the beauty of Earth that will come with global warming, I know that nuclear war will utterly destroy it. Nuclear conflict, as diplomat Thomas Countryman observes, is climate change at supersonic speed. The destruction that may come about in 6 or 7 decades from global warming may come about from nuclear conflict in the next 6 or 7 minutes. That's why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists puts the clock at 100 seconds to midnight. That's why former Secretary of Defense William Perry and former head of Strategic Nuclear Forces, General Lee Butler, both have said that we are in as great a danger as in any time in the Cold War and begged the public to work to reduce the nuclear peril. Global warming may have come about through human misdeeds and carelessness, but it did not come about through a wish to destroy. The nuclear arsenal, in contrast, with the US and Russia together owning 93% of the total arsenal and seven other states together owning the remaining 7%, that nuclear arsenal had no other purpose than cruelty. The most recent figures on nuclear winter show that if even 1/100th of 1%, so not 1%, but 1/100th of 1% of the current arsenal is used, 44 million people will die on one afternoon, and 1 billion people will die from starvation in the first month. The exchange whether precipitated by accident, by hacking, or as is most likely by one of the state leaders, is unlikely to remain at 0.1%. And it is ready to go. If it takes thousands upon thousands of steps to put a nuclear architecture into place, and let us, for simplicity, say that it takes just 10,000 steps. Of these 10,000, 9,999 are complete. Yes, we've scheduled $1 trillion to make new nuclear weapons, but all the already existing ones are already in place. There is only one step of the 10,000 steps that remains to be done, and that is the issuing of a launch order by the leader of one of the nuclear states. The launch order, which requires in the United States no consultation or consent from any second person, that is, the president acts wholly alone, is, according to former missile launch officer Bruce Blair, the length of a tweet. Actually, he said it's half the length of a tweet. I began by saying that if an unjust framework is in place, it won't inspire us to care to be just, and that it's possible we are standing in the midst of a wrong that is easily the equal of slavery in America or concentration camps in Germany. This is the framework, the nuclear arsenal that I had in mind. If you don't know about the nuclear peril, I hope each time a sunset or a flower or a friend's face stops you in your tracks, you will take it as a call to learn about our nuclear architecture and to help dismantle this most unjust of perils. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Elaine, for this incredibly comprehensive and provocative presentation. And there are quite a number of questions that people have posted for our Q&A. So I'll start with an earlier one and we'll see how far we get. The first comes from Leah Bradshaw, who says, it seems that the relationship between beauty and art may be precarious. I once went to an art exhibit of Picasso's personal collection, and I left because I had such a visceral revulsion to many of the paintings of women's realigned and disfigured bodies. Picasso is widely recognized as one of the greatest modern artists. There is little symmetry in Picasso's art. What makes Picasso such an acclaimed artist? Can we talk about a terrible beauty? Do you think that we could invoke Plato to censor someone like Picasso? Is Picasso reveling in a kind of injustice through his art?
Well, it's a good question, an important question, one that I think we often ask ourselves. So to begin with, I think there are, as I said in the midst of the lecture, there are objects of beauty that we can all agree on. And then there are many objects of beauty that moisten our individual minds and that don't necessarily work that way for other people. And sometimes it's alarming when we find discrepancies in our sense of what beauty is or what an example of beauty is. But I don't think we should be. It's also the case that one reason we have places of learning and music schools and many avenues of education is because it's often, though there are some things that are self-evidently beautiful, like the song of a nightingale or the song of a mockingbird, there are other things that really require assistance in seeing the beauty. I think that I have often reacted to Picasso's drawings of women in something like the way you did. And then I happened to go to an exhibit in Chelsea just a few years ago where it had a whole sequence of this one young woman that he often painted and often drew a picture of. And it actually transformed my ability to see what he was doing with the visage of women. But I think that the example you raise is one that will no doubt be debated for a long time. The one thing I would qualify is when you say it doesn't have symmetry, often when people say that something doesn't have symmetry, they're talking about some small degree of asymmetry. So, for example, people will often say, aren't the most beautiful faces often very, very asymmetrical? That is, the faces that might be, great models. Now, let's take that assertion as a true statement. In fact, some scientific studies have shown that it's actually highly symmetrical faces that are held by people in all different countries to be most pleasing. But let's just take the intuition that some people have that asymmetrical faces are very, very beautiful. What level of asymmetry are we talking about? We're not talking about a soldier who's just had part of his face blown away, as Pat Barker writes about in one of her most recent novels. And then the injury is unspeakable. Or let's say somebody has bone cancer in their face. Again, the unspeakable tragedy of having a face without symmetry. So I think in many cases, and we can debate the degree of asymmetry in the drawings and paintings you're speaking of with Picasso, but I think that even if we would vary in the degree of asymmetry we assigned, that it's got some framing asymmetry. Furthermore, one thing that we do is like to show that we can create beyond necessity. So we start by creating just enough food to restore whatever calories we've expended in hoeing the field, and yet we want to go beyond that and be able to create many more calories than we actually expend in plowing the field. And eventually, we may get to make this, bizarre, extravagant cake that, is so far beyond caloric need that it simply certifies our ability to create beyond necessity. We should remember that Augustine in De Musica mentions cakes as an object of beauty. So it's a good question, and not a question that anyone can easily and decisively answer.
So here are two different questions that converge in focusing us on asking more about the connection between beauty and injury by two people who, on the one hand, say, it's curious, isn't it, that increasingly unjust societies, Nazis or communists, increasingly commit themselves to the destruction of beauty in all its forms. Or someone else says, in some cases, it seems like those who are very perceptive of beauty are not averse to inciting injuries. We've all heard stories of Nazis who loved beautiful classic music, and yet were indifferent to the suffering of the Jewish people that they murdered. In fact, beauty can not only fail to induce an aversion to injury, it can also pull us to destruction. In the example given that someone might pluck a beautiful flower because it is beautiful, or be possessive and jealous of the beautiful individuals they love and inflict injury. So asking for more clarification about the link between beauty and justice.
Okay, so I think two things is true of the Hitler example. And one thing is that the description is accurate that you've just summarized, Brinton, that there was a great love of beauty at the same time that there was all this cruelty. By the way, there's pounding rain in the house, so tell me if you've ceased to be able to hear me. And no doubt there's rain in many places where the rest of you are as well. But at any rate, let's say that Hitler and company really did love beauty. To that, I would say that anything can be coupled with anything else. We saw that honoring the solstice was honored by the Nazis. We saw that motherhood was honored by the Nazis, but we don't say, let's stop noticing when the solstice comes. We don't say, let's give up on motherhood. The Nazis like it. We don't say, let's give up on medical experiments. Nazis carried out medical experiments. Why, in the case of beauty, would we make that conclusion that somehow beauty is damaged and revealed to be complicit in the injury in a way that we don't believe motherhood or the solstice is complicit. But now I'll give you the second interpretation, which is the one I believed, which is that the Nazis were no more beauty loving than, well, let me just stop it there. They were not beauty loving. And the analogy that often comes to my mind is to imagine somebody, and this is an ugly example I'm going to give you, but far less ugly than what Hitler did. Imagine somebody who broke the legs of 100 ballet dancers and then held up a postcard of Degas and started shouting that he loved ballet. Should we really hold our heads and say, isn't this puzzling? This person loves ballet, but look at the cruelty he carried out. Did it incite his cruelty? No, we would say, we would recognize as completely hollow his claim to love Degas or ballet or anything. To me, the fact that people are willing to take Nazis at their word that they love beauty when they violated the most fundamental fact of beauty, that is, its aversion to injury, they destroyed beauty. Look at the bodies of the people they destroyed. You're looking at beauty. And the fact that 60 or 70 years later, we're still willing to parrot what he told us to say is I think incorrect. But I understand there are going to be different points of view on this. So at least I think we should take the first precaution, and just as we accept motherhood and the solstice, accept beauty, and with more thought, maybe arrive at the second conclusion. This is not a culture that was beauty loving.
Thank you. There are many, many people on the Q&A and chat who want to thank you for an extraordinary talk, for a beautiful set of connections, and several questions about Simone Weil. One questioner, Mary Meany, says Simone Weil speaks of mere human natural justice as respecting symmetry, and it only exists when both sides are equally powerful. So what about when she calls, quote unquote, the folly of love, which spreads out to those who do not possess any power? What about Christ's love expressed in his incarnation, in suffering and death, that cannot be answered on our side in an equal way, even by the greatest of saints? There's no symmetry, yet I'd like to claim that it was beautiful.
It's full of, the question you've read is full of rich reflections. And can you, Brenton, summarize the question for me? Because
I think it's more of a statement than a question. And it's a statement in which, which focuses on Christ's love expressed in the incarnation, suffering, and death, in which she argues there are not symmetries. There's no symmetry, and yet she sees them as beautiful.
well, you know, I mean, first of all, she certainly says that the fact of Christ being in bodily pain is crucial. And you know, I would say that the fact that God in Christ is understood to have been taken on a body that puts him on the same level with human beings is precisely does make them reciprocal or symmetrical. In the Hebrew scriptures, where she objects to the cruelty, and where I've also written a great deal about the cruelty in those writings, there's a tremendous asymmetry. God has no body at all, and human beings have a body whose capacity to be turned into a canvas of sores becomes a demonstration, a template of demonstration of God's power. Whereas I would think that Simone Weil think that Jesus, precisely by taking on a body, is much more an example of willfully taking on a symmetry with human beings, and even a body that can be harmed very gravely, even a body that can die. Have I understood the question enough?
I think we're approximating it. And here's another one from Gail Mooney that moves in this direction, who says, how does the beauty of Christ on the cross or the beauty of the plowshares activists to deface the nuclear submarine plant in Kings Bay, Georgia, who are now serving prison terms for their protest, fit with your equation that injury is the opposite of beauty? So these are examples from that she sees as injury that are beautiful.
Well, I mean, in the case of the Plowshares 7, and in the case of, for example, Megan Rice, who broke into Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and defaced the weapons, I think that those acts of destruction are destruction of things that are, and I don't use the term loosely, genocidal. I mean, today in the news, we're hearing the word genocide used for China. It seems to me not in cases where people are being in large numbers killed, but these weapons really are genocidal. And so I don't see any contradiction in dismantling things which cause injury. To dismantle a weapon is to neutralize it so that it can no longer provide an injury. As for the beauty of Jesus, I suppose one could say the wounds of Jesus are beautiful, but I think more often it's the courage of Jesus that's beautiful. It's the grace of Jesus that's beautiful. It's his patience with the disciples who need proof, Thomas needing to put his fingers in the wounds, disciples who fall asleep and could not watch with him in the garden. All these perceptual lapses that Jesus so patiently honors and accepts. So now I think that many people have observed that it's possible to do a beautiful painting of an injury that doesn't itself inflict an injury, but that attempts to elicit some level of compassion for the injured person. So it's certainly the case that the injured state of Jesus is held steadily before us. There would be many forms of injury where it's over and done, like the stab of a sword, whereas being placed on a cross keeps the person, in this case Jesus, affixed to the implement of the injury.
Thank you. And here's a question from Teju Cole, who thanks you for the truly lovely lecture, especially for bringing out the joyous aspect of Simone Weil, which is often ignored. How does your account of beauty as an opposite of injury accommodate theories of beauty like the wabi-sabi, which locate beauty in what is poor, broken, and imperfect?
Well, a lovely question, and greetings, Teju. I think, again, the work of beauty is to enable us to see beauty in more and more things, to see beauty not in the razzle dazzle of gold, which was love because it caught the light and caught the light even after the sun was going down, but in things that simply had a kind of simple shape. Or the other day there was on my kitchen counter the lid of a pot that had a little, cupped handle. So the lid ordinarily would be like this with a tiny little handle, but it was upside down, so it was balanced. And I was kind of aghast that I had looked in that direction because I wanted to look at some daffodils I had put there. And instead, my attention was arrested by the lid of the pot. I think that is the operation of beauty. I don't mean that it's the work of the perceiver even, but even the work of beautiful things is not to appropriate all the energy of perception to itself, but to ready one to see beauty hugely present throughout the world.
Thank you. I think we have time only for one more question. This is another question about Simone Weil, who from Michael Giesbrecht, who says, how can we square your insistence on symmetry with Weil's constant insistence on the primacy of contradiction? And he quotes, all truth contains a contradiction, from Simone Weil.
Well, the simple answer is I don't know. And one reason why I'm glad to be part of this conference and to being ready to listen to many more papers is I want to learn much more about her. But I think that she might well say that the contradiction involves, balancing alternatives or something. I don't know. But she certainly thinks that that the providential overview, the beauty of the world, involves a kind of analogical balancing of multiple terms, and it might be that that is entailed in the solution to that question. That is, it may be that A and B and C and D contradict one another, but it might be that A is to B as C is to D, and that they, by being analogical pairs, recover some symmetry. Even in the things I said today, I mean, I talked about the superabundance of her own ecstatic reaction to beauty. Even that can seem, superabundance can seem slightly out of line with proportion. So it doesn't seem startling to me that there are going to be some possible confusions that need sorting out along the way.
Well, I think that you have done as much justice to these questions as the time permitted, and that this public follows some of your previous publics in asking many important consequential questions about the symmetry, justice, balance, etc. But I'd like to close with thanking you so much for your time with us and looking forward to your being with us over the next few days. And with one of our participants who phrased it this way: thank you for your beautiful thoughts, Professor Scarry. They stopped me in my tracks today and broke the spell of my self-absorption.
Oh, how lovely. Thank you.
So thank you all for being with us today and for your attendance at the upcoming conference. And the link is in the chat if you didn't have it, to register. And we look forward to being with you. And once again, thank you so much, Elaine, for being with us this afternoon and for the exceptionally provocative conversation.
My thanks to you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.